I think for them, too, they didn't have to do anything too drastic to get what they perceived could be a quality quarterback. They didn't have to give up anything to be in that position to do that. And they were able to upgrade at positions they needed as well. I mean, Kaiser is rough around the edges. We don't know what we're going to get with him. He's got all the physical styles and height and weight that you'd want to see from a quarterback, and he should be able to compete right now. I think in the Cleveland sense, they liked him enough to say, well, let's see what we're going to get out of him, and Cleveland can still assess the situation next season if they need to in a much more quarterback-heavy draft.
Oh, yeah. Next year is going to be one of the best drafts if you like quarterbacks. I looking at the list a couple of weeks ago, I looked at it and I said, there are 7 quarterbacks that I could see going in the first round.
It could be 7. Very possible, and there's a lot of teams out there that need either quarterbacks now or they're going to need quarterbacks to replace aging ones in the future. So I wouldn't be surprised if next year we don't see a lot of quarterbacks come out of next year's draft in anticipation of guys retiring or just a flat need at that point.
Yeah. So the quarterback-heavy draft next season, I think, is going to be a lot of teams' best friend. Because
I agree with that.
You got, well, we're just speculating at this point, but you got Sam Darnold, who is the stud from USC. There's Josh Rosen from UCLA, Baker Mayfield from Oklahoma, Mason Rudolph from Oklahoma State, Luke Falk from Washington State. There's
a lot of what look like quality quarterbacks coming out of this draft who will have multiple years of tape under their belt to find out and get a better idea of what you're really getting for your money.
Right, absolutely.
And that'll be the difference in my opinion.
Right. And so now we're going to move away from, we'll basically just talked about the quarterbacks. Tony, were there any picks, aside from anything the Giants, Cowboys, or Jets did, that really confused you or you thought was a good pick? Anything of note from the other 29 teams in the NFL?
I mean, I don't know if I'd say of note. I think there were a couple of teams that had pretty solid draft classes this year in their pick selection. I think Indianapolis did rather well in their show. I think Atlanta actually did a very good job considering the picks that they had. To be honest, the one thing that surprised me, one thing I enjoyed about the draft, actually, I'll start there, is
all the Ohio State players.
Well, I love that. I knew that was going to happen. You can get used to that because as long as Urban Meyers is there recruiting, they're going to keep going off the board. But I liked the Philly atmosphere. I thought it was great. I enjoy this moving NFL draft. I think they should keep doing this. I think it's a good selling point, and it allows fans of other teams to really experience the draft firsthand. So I think that was a positive coming out of it. What I found surprising the most is with all this talk building up, especially centered around Mixon, on questionable character flaws, it didn't seem like a lot of teams had a problem drafting people with either pending issues or prior issues or issues that had just come up without hesitation to do so, even in early rounds. Some people did suffer from it, like Mixon, but you get a steal. Obviously, what they did is not correct, and that's one thing, but everybody does deserve the second chance. But I was surprised at how quickly people came off the board with these issues, given how big of a deal it seemed to be made that teams would completely ignore said players with one issue, yet it seems like a lot of them were willing to take the risk.
Right, yeah. So some of the players that you're referencing, Jabril Peppers with the quote-unquote tested positive for diluted sample. Same thing with Reuben Foster. You had Gary Conley, who's going through a really nasty period where we don't know many of the facts, if really any, involved in his rape case that's going on. You've got Joe Mixon and Jordan Lewis, who are both domestic abuse issues that they have going on. So there were a lot of questionable character flaws.
I mean, even down to Mr. Irrelevant, because, I mean, Kelly's had his issues getting kicked off of Clemson when he did. He's had his off-the-field issues, too, with
fighting at his brother's...
his brother's football game or something, like prep game. So, I mean... It seems like whether it's one thing or another, there was a lot of people in this draft who had issues, and I was kind of surprised that it didn't cost many of them too much in a sense, because teams were still willing to take the gamble.
Okay, yeah, there are so many players that have their own personal demons, and a lot of people do deserve second chance, especially when it comes to something that Jabril Peppers and Reuben Foster, whether they would have tested positive or not. Same thing with Laramie Tunsil a couple of years ago. Drug issues, especially if it's something that's like not a real problem, like, oh, you tested positive for marijuana, or this minor steroid that you used for
vitamin supplement that had something else in it. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
As long as it's not like human growth hormone or like I don't know how many of our listeners watch wrestling or have watched wrestling, but recently Sean Waltman, formerly known as X-Pac, 123 Kid 6, whatever you know him as, was caught at an airport trying to smuggle weed and meth onto a plane to sell overseas.
That's just stupid.
That's an issue.
Well, yes. But it's completely separate from the ones you're bringing up. I mean, those can be other things. I was just surprised. I think it was more on the character aspect issues with guys that have pending charges or being accused of crimes or have had videos where it was a domestic situation, or not even a domestic situation, but more of just an assault situation on somebody, and the team's willing to take that gamble. Because I remember in the lead up into the week, there was always the talk about Mixon. Where's he going to go? How's it going to be taken? And I think unfairly so in Mixon's case. I mean, there was the video that makes it relevant, but there were a lot of other players out there that had other things going on, and there were a lot more teams willing to take the risk on these players than was previously thought.
Yeah, and especially being that he wasn't the only one in the draft that had that specific type of issue, domestic abuse issue. Like I said, we'll forgive Reuben Foster and Jabril Peppers whether they tested positive for any drugs or not. That's completely different. That's completely separate from Gary and Conley with the rape case, with Jordan Lewis and Joe Mixon with the domestic abuse cases. Yeah. Even with Chad Kelly jumping onto a field and fighting high schoolers.
Yeah, and that's just, it's not acceptable in those instances. It's hard to really classify them because you've got to break it down. Each situation is different, and I think it just showed clearly that if the talent is there and your need as a team is there are certain things that can be overlooked or felt that they could be coached maturity-wise.
If Joe Mixon belongs on any team, it is the team that drafted him, the Cincinnati Bengals.
Well, they're by far the most understanding. I mean, they've had Pac-Man Jones. They've
Chris Henry.
They let Burfict get away with murder half of the time, and they just brush it off. So, I mean, I'm not surprised if he's going to go anywhere. It would be the Bengals, or that they were one of the 4 teams into consideration for him. None of that surprises me, really. So, I mean, I guess it's fitting. That might be one of the most fitting picks of the entire draft.
Right. Now, another player that we had just talked about, I want to elaborate a little more, that had an issue on the field and off the field was Chad Kelly. Now, this thought just occurred to me, and I don't know why. Earlier in a previous podcast, I compared Trace McSorley and Johnny Manziel. Is
Mm-hmm.
Chad Kelly like Johnny Manziel? Is that a fair comparison? Besides the fact that Chad Kelly's far superior as a quarterback.
Well, Chad Kelly's going to be. I mean, he's built more like a quarterback, and certainly has, I believe, a higher degree of talent. But there is that concern, very Johnny Manziel-ish, off the field. Are you getting a kid that's just looking to have fun and doesn't really understand the effects of his actions? That would be my major concern with taking him. That being said, where he went to Denver, selected him with the last pick of the draft.
Yeah.
If he's going to go somewhere and learn from somebody, he might as well be around John Elway, because John Elway might be able to show him the ropes as far as what it means to be an actual adult, and it might actually work out well in Chad Kelly's favor.
I mean, John Elway might even be friends with his uncle.
There's a good chance of that too, and hopefully somebody inside of Kelly's family after these incidences, after he left Clemson, went back to Ole Miss, that somebody's keeping him in line and trying to keep a close voice in his ear to make it apparent that, listen, you're lucky you went as the last overall pick, quite frankly. So count it as a blessing and make something of it rather than let it go to waste.
I would hope so. Hopefully someone really gets in his ear and pushes him. Maybe John Elway's the guy to do it, but I mean, if Dabo Swinney couldn't fix him, not necessarily fix him, but couldn't set the ship straight at Clemson, I don't know that there are many people who can.
Yeah, and that's certainly true too. I mean, but you got to also chalk it. I'm not going to look too much into it because I'm also going to chalk up a lot of his discretions early and the issues at Clemson as lack of maturity. I mean, he had to go to play in community college ball and almost realized his dream was done there. He was lucky to get into a school like Ole Miss afterwards, and he was lucky to even be drafted. So if I was in his position, and I hope he views it this way, take it as a blessing and actually try and show people that they were wrong about the first perception of you in college.
Right, and I think it's funny that the person who gets picked in his position is Mr. Irrelevant, because he is very relevant.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the guy with that amount of potential, if you can get him to take it seriously and can get him to mature and develop, I mean, where you got him, given his size and the skills that he does possess, Mr. Irrelevant could be a steal this year.
Oh, seriously, he could end up not that he's going to be as good as Tom Brady, but he could be remembered as the Tom Brady of this draft class.
Yeah, he could be remembered. Like, I could foresee, again, if all of those things I previously mentioned actually go to fruition, I could see him being one of those people that you hear about later starting, and he was the last overall pick taken in the 2017 draft. And just all the teams and all the people that got picked ahead of him, and us having this conversation in years from now.
Yeah, I think, honestly, watching him play at Ole Miss, when he is on, he is on. He's beaten Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
He's beaten LSU.
Mm-hmm.
He has beaten Mississippi State. So you just took out the three defenses in the Big 12, or the Big 12 in the SEC.
Yeah.
He took out the three big defenses in the SEC.
Yeah, and also the front runners in the SEC. So we know he can play against the top level talent. And again, can you get him to buy into the program? Can you get him to realize that this isn't college anymore? You're not a kid. This is a job. You have to take this seriously. That'll be interesting to see if it happens.
I'm hoping Trevor Siemian, who is just an overall good guy, can really get into him, because there's no doubt he's going to be the starting quarterback in Denver within a year.
I don't think that there is any doubt of that. I mean, there's a reason Denver picked him and wanted to have him. Siemian may be the right guy to show him the reins of what it's like to be a pro here, and hopefully with some mentorship in that Denver building. Kelly will actually